growing up in Texas in the 70s and the 80s, I encountered Christians. Now, of course, part of this is just I was a kid and a teenager. And kids and teenagers have weird relationships with other people in the best of circumstances. um, and so, yeah, the question of authenticity, I'm not sure is even real. I may have encountered many authentic Christians who are in beautiful ways. I just didn't notice it. But the image that I formed, and I think the culture really, really didn't help. I'm quite certain our culture has been spending a lot of time, just like our culture has been kind of painting the father as buffoon, Homer Simpson and Married with Children across the entire field, obligate. It's also been painting Christians as hypocrites, more or less, or repressed or artificial or something like that. Which is not to say that's not present. You can't do a something that nobody experiences. You can't actually make that be an image. But now that I've actually entered into a authentic, deep, committed Christian community, and initially not as a Christian, I mean, the reality of it is very, very different than the image that I had, and that I think is quite dominant in the culture. And my heart went out to you when you said you couldn't find a church where you could church.
Yeah. All right. So hello and welcome back to Climbing Mount Sophia. I'm here again with Jordan Hall. Thank you so much for coming, Jordan. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Yeah, this is going to be a good conversation, I think.
Yeah. So a bit of context for this conversation. So this conversation was scheduled after me seeing a tweet that you wrote, I think in response to, I'd have to pull it up. I don't want to do that, but it was in relation to the question of where does religion fit in culture, and sort of evaluating religion on its own terms rather than evaluating religion in terms of how it does in the language of science and journalism.
Right.
Which strikes me as really, really important because, as I was saying, I've before we started recording, I find myself sort of living my life on this razor edge between Christianity and sort of secular naturalistic rationalism. And I've sort of, I don't know, I feel like, I don't know how to say it. I haven't been to church in a long time, since COVID. But in the journey of not being at church, I find myself continually more of a Christian. We can talk about maybe what I mean by that, but and I would like to go to church, but I haven't found any place that I feel like I can actually go to church. And that's a whole nother part. But at the same time, I've gained so much, I've learned so much from the more rationalist, scientific, naturalist, secular way of thinking. And so I'm just trying to listen to both sides and sort of try to understand what's coming out between it, or actually live what's coming out between it, more like. And so then obviously the final piece is just, you obviously had this conversation with Daniel Thorson where you say, hey, guys, I'm a Christian, I've done the thing. I'm a Christian now. Which of course I think you saw, I wrote a piece about it, just a short, little reflection on my Substack.
I did.
And so those are all the things that I'm sort of throwing on the table that I want to talk to you about.
Well, it's going to be a lot of ground to cover. I noticed that I'm attracted to this question, just the original question, like that tweet, which does something like straddles the secular sacred divide in some meaningful fashion, and that it actually it'll be hard. But okay, if it's a hard thing, let's do a hard thing. I don't mean emotionally hard, in some sense cognitively more. It's weird, actually. Maybe existentially hard is the right way of putting it, but we'll see. And then the other one is, of course, I'm happy to talk to you about anything in terms of this new journey that I've been on. You're one of the first people who I spoke with, who is explicitly coming from a Christian perspective, or was out as a Christian, in the context of this sort of larger, in this case, more than John Vervaeke universe. And so there was some encouragement of you in the back of my mind as I was going and grabbing like the cat going into the bathtub, holding onto under the eye of the needle, as it were. So we can talk about that too.
Great. Wonderful. Yeah. I mean, Well, I guess one of the things that comes up for me there, hearing that, like, let's start at the tweet then. Like, let's start at the tweet and this idea, right? That there's something about the religious language that has to be taken on its own terms. And I like that you brought up the sort of existential aspect, because that's how it feels to me. It's like if the scientific and journalistic frames of thought, frames of language, all these things, like there's this sort of sense of being removed from it. You're talking about something over there, something else. But with the religious, like if you're not taking it on, if you're not being in it, it's not you're not even talking about it in some sense.
Right. And so this is, I think, the part that is often lost in the in the secular mind. Let me see if we can get down there. It's funny. It's almost like microsurgery. If we can get down to the very specific nib, it becomes very clear. So, pardon me. There's an epistemological bias, and I don't mean that in the sense of like a wrongness. I mean in the sense of an unconscious postulate in the dominant mindset of the secular West, which is the scientific and the journalistic mindset. And as you said, this has a third person perspective. You are removed from, and I would say the most important piece is obligate decontextualization. You can think about that from the scientific point of view. That's literally the requirement. And the scientific point of view, experiments have to be able to be done by many different people in many different locations, as much as possible to remove the relevance of the context and isolate the particular of the objective third person or the decontextualized event. And that's the scientific method is that. And that's an important part of reality.
Yeah.
So then the next piece is that the religious perspective is obligate relational, which is obligate contextualized, but even more than context, actual relationship. Because what happens is if you say contextualized, it's almost like we have this flip. If you say decontextualized, contextualized, that's coming from a obligate decontextualized frame. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually flip all the way over. It's not context, it's relationship.
Yeah.
Shifts. And by the way, this is where things like having a personal relationship with God becomes so central and so crucial. If you're having a decontextualized, if you're having an object relationship with God, a conceptual relationship with God, you're sitting over here and talking about stuff over here. And you're entirely missing the point. Like so fundamentally missing the point that you can't even articulate how much you're missing the point. It's an utterly wrong place to be. So you have to go over here. And once you've gone over here, everything changes. Like it's a different kind of mind or a different kind of way of being in relationship. That's kind of the point. It's not even mind, right? It's a different kind of way of being in a relationship because it's pure relationality. It's also whole. The whole of you has to be fully in relationship, not the mind part of you, right? Decontextualize parts of you in particular kinds of relationships, the whole of you in the whole of relationships. So that right there, like that partition, if that's clear, it is decisive. Like it really does frame both as very distinct, but I think helps understand the transformation of what happens as you move across that boundary. And I think if you get it even a little bit, if you're sitting over here, this is where you live. If you even get a little bit of what I'm saying right now, you'll begin to understand the magnitude or it's a qualitative transformation. You can't just reach over here and try to do something in this fashion. It's just trying to figure out how to describe it. It's a little bit like, it's not a bad metaphor of saying, okay, I've got X, Y, Z dimensions in a three-dimensional space. But we'll make you the villain in this. You've got only X and Y. And so I'm trying to explain Z to you, and you're moving around X and Y like crazy. And it's like, no, you don't get it. It's not more or less X. It's not more or less Y.
Right.
It's Z. Yeah. So it's something like that.
Yeah, I like that analogy because, okay, so a couple things come up for me there where you're talking about. One is the notion of, I'll start here, stumbling stone, right? So this is a biblical notion. And like Christ is talked about as a stumbling stone in relation to sort of the wisdom of the world, right? And I think this is why, is because like Christ, so a little bit of my personal history, right? Like I broke into doing this sort of whole online stuff and YouTube through having a conversation with John Vervaeke, where he pushed me exactly on the point of like, well, who is Jesus really? Like, what's really happening when Jesus, specifically on the cross, when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And that sort of like, that's become this thing for me where like, I mean, it's taken me to depths I could never imagine, because I've just not let go of that as a quest of what what the heck are we talking about when we're talking about a person who is also God? Like, what the heck are we talking about there? Like I don't have an answer. And I've read a lot of stuff about it, and I don't know that anybody has a real answer to it, but there's something about the recurrence of stumbling over this question, recurrence of stumbling over the fact that I can't answer the question, that has shifted my participation in the world such that there's a depth available to me, like your z-axis, right? There's a depth of relation that has become available to me such that the content of the relation of the relata hasn't changed, but the depth of the possibility of the relations has changed significantly through precisely this sort of like it's like a grinding against this flipping where it's like, no, I can't relate to God like as a thing over here, because the claim is in fact that he's somehow like underneath me and beyond me in a way that totally doesn't make any sense at all, right? Like you can't like make sense of it in the way we're used to making sense of things, but you can weirdly you can call yourself into relation with that, that it just blows you open.
I'm calling that whole category of that last thing faith. Right. I had a conversation, I think actually in the conversation with Jim Rutt. I said, look,
Yeah.
you're sitting over here in this world. There's this pejorative, slandering of the notion of faith that describes it as something like maximally degenerate or maximally delusional belief. So it's not just belief, it's willful belief in things you know for sure aren't true, right? Like, wow,
Right.
the craziest possible version of it. And that ain't it. That's not what it is. Okay, so what is it? What are we talking about? Now, obviously, I am a neophyte in theology, so I beg the forgiveness of those who are vastly wiser than me, which is effectively everybody. So I'm probably getting certain things wrong from scripture, but the sense is something like faith is more like a faculty, like you said, sense making, right, which lives kind of more over here in between. Faith is kind of like that same sort of thing. It's the way that we navigate this kind of relationship that you're talking about. The way that think about the way that an infant, a newborn, can't really actually see. And there's the retina has not yet actually been exposed to differentials of how photons land on it. And so the infant is learning how to see for the first few days. There's no depth, there's no color distinction. It takes quite some time to develop anything. And the first pattern, by the way, is the pattern of the mother's face. And and then it builds from there. And of course, seeing, it was just so basic to us, right? And you can do walking is a nice, much more, one that's more ready to hand. We're more familiar with watching children with how to walk. Okay, faith is that kind of thing. We have an innate capacity to navigate this quality of relationship with this person, this personal relationship. But it takes work, right? We have to actually stumble. We have to go through these stumbling blocks. And of course, because we've been growing up in a world that it lives over here, it makes the stumbling all the more challenging. So Christ as stumbling block, a lot of things come in almost like these existential koans that make it so that your sense making just breaks. You're like, okay, shoot, sorry, sense making isn't the right faculty. I have to move over here, start honing this other faculty so I can begin to build like skillfulness or elegance or something like that in faith. So that's the way I've been trying to figure out a way to name that other thing, because there is something else going on over there. That this is why sense making doesn't, as we understand it, doesn't work. And yet
Yeah.
there's something that's going on that isn't random. And
Yeah.
it's not made up, it's real. And I've noticed that I can get better at it. So, okay,
Yeah.
there's a developmental capacity.
Yeah. Oh man, this is really good. This is really good. Yeah, because faith is another one of these sorts of stumbling stones, I think. Like
Mm-hmm.
just faith as a thing, right? Because exactly of what you called out. Thank you for laying that out. Like, yeah, it's like you say faith in any sort of like serious thinking context, people are like, oh, okay, roll their eyes, right? But it's like, no, hold on, hold on. We're not talking about the sort of faith that like, you know, somebody wants you to, your next door neighbor who sort of lives a life that you certainly don't admire, but claims to believe in something that they obviously don't really like participate in. Like
That's
we're
good
not
as
talking about that.
yeah.
um, and I
We're not
wonder,
we're not talking about it like a 5-year-old girl's steadfast belief in fairies and in the tooth fairy, right?
right?
And she draws pictures of it. She really believes in it. Yeah, that's not what we're talking about either. We're talking
Yeah.
about where there's things that are showing up in life that clearly are evidence of something that is meaningful, good, and strong that you don't understand. In fact, that maybe violate your understanding in some profound way that you don't even understand why or how it's violating your understanding. And so it orients you in a direction of growth, like that transformational participatory thing.
Mm, 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 mm. Oh, that's really interesting. So let's just talk about faith here a little bit because this is, I mean, that's yeah.
And
Because
by the
so one
way,
of the
to caveat, faith asterisk. Um, if I'm engaging in heresy, I will willfully accept being burned at the stake. I apologize, but I'm doing my best.
yeah, yeah, I'm very much a sort of like well, okay, here's the way to say it. So this guy Bulgakov, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, Sergei
I've
Bulgakov.
heard of him a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm really into Sophia, right? My channel is named Climbing Mount Sophia, and he wrote some really good books about Sophia. And one of the things that he says is, I have the courage. What I have the courage to to risk being to risk heresy with the hope that I might say something great about God.
Nice.
And it's like for me, that's like, yeah, that's where I'm at, right? Like I'm pretty willing to I'm with you. I'm pretty willing to risk being burnt at the stake, mostly because I have this sensibility of like something needs to change with how we interact with religion. Like
Yeah. Yeah, that's nice.
clearly, clearly something's gone wrong here, and we're not better off for it. And so, however, I'm willing to sort of lay myself out here to at at the risk of laying myself out such that maybe something great might emerge. Okay. But so one of the things that Pageau says about faith is that faith is this sort of faculty capacity to intuit a level beyond what we understand already
Mm-hmm.
and move into it despite being completely unable to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of something I hear you gesturing at a little bit. And I'm wondering to connect it back to your story that I've heard from the Jim Rutt conversation and the Daniel Thorson conversation. You talk a lot about your attempts to um, participate with these sort of game B civium type attempts of real embodied participation with it. And in a sense, like I felt a sense of, frustration, a sense of frustration is not the primary thing, a sense of sadness, maybe. And I don't, I'm projecting here, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but a sense of maybe sadness at like something that I take from you to be a really, wholehearted, well-meaning, good faith, like well-reasoned attempt to really participate with something, and then like, oh shit, this keeps going wrong. What the hell? Um, and then how you're talking about faith to me sounds like a sort of similar thing, but there's a really deep difference between this sort of like this calculated, I want to participate with something that I have all these things in place that I think this is going to go somewhere, and then it's like, damn it, it doesn't. So I don't want to project too much on you here, but I want to, I'm just curious.
I think you're sensing properly. Yeah, definitely a sense of like a sadness and a frustration. Although the frustration had been worn away enough that it wasn't the whole, they didn't have the energy to move. So like a sadness that even moved into something like resignation.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm quite sure where to go from there. So hmm, the question is something like, yeah, because you said something different. There's something that is different about this, about faith, let's say, as it is understood in the Christian context, just to be very clear. And of course, the most obvious difference is God. So maybe we can just sort of jump there, right? There's actually
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
If you imagine a process where you're groping in the dark, climbing, let's say you're sort of climbing out of a cave in the dark, and you're groping for a handhold.
Mhm.
There's a significant amount of effort, may make some progress, or you can climb up. But then if you imagine that same process where there's actually light and
Mm.
fresh air that's coming from somewhere, that's a completely different kind of thing. It's like a
Yeah,
different
yeah, yeah.
thing. You're still groping largely in the dark, right? You're still learning, but two things are happening. One, you've got an orienting basis that tells you what direction is the right direction. And you've
Mm.
got a progression where as you get closer, you get more light and more fresh air, which makes it actually more encouraging and stronger.
Mm.
In this case, we have not
Mm.
only the actual presence of God, but we also have the revelation, right, that God has reached down into our world and given us, a handhold, not even light and air, but a rope, which is probably a minimum requirement, and a whole church, right, for thousands of years, who have been working on the same problem with deep devotion, and then a whole church of people nearby, right, who are committed in lives with deep devotion. So yeah, that's, if you sort of like say it that way, like wow, it actually is. That's actually really rather quite different. And
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
want
Yeah.
to, I was noticing this after my conversation with the Doomer Optimism people yesterday. It's fun because from a hyper conversation perspective, I don't know which of these is going to come out before the other. And as an FYI, in that conversation, I had a really big beard. I shaved it last night at my wife's request.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's all kind of fun, sort of temporal, spatio-temporal. Um, I one of the things I grew up with was a negative image of Christians. That, for example, one of the main things I mentioned was one of the things I've experienced in the relationships I've been having is let's call it authentic authenticity or real
Mm.
authenticity, right?
Mm.
Which is neither um, like the false front of interacting with a shiny persona, nor the more subtle but even more challenging pseudo authenticity that you kind of get more in the kind of elite blue postmodern universes. But a more humble, radically more humble, real authenticity. Say, hey, guess what? I was a drug addict and a thief, and blah blah blah. Like I was a prostitute and blankety blank, right? I was, or whatever, right? It doesn't matter. But the point is not neither pride nor attachment nor shame in a deep way around who you were, but an acknowledgement that that was part of your life journey and your arc, and maybe even part of the gift, because now you have the ability to have a quality of relationship that other people can't have because you've experienced first person for real. And here's how your relationship with Christ has shifted you in profound ways that you can only have gratitude for. That grace is gratitude. I have, obviously can't take responsibility or ownership for it, but I could say, hey, wow. And here I am, and now I'm endeavoring to show up fully as a disciple of Christ, and here's how that works for me now. That whole arc, I can't say I really had that experience as a kid. When I
Mm.
was young, growing up in Texas in the 70s and the 80s, I encountered Christians. Now, of course, part of this is just I was a kid and a teenager. And kids and teenagers have weird relationships with other people in the best of circumstances. um, and so, the question of authenticity, I'm not sure is even real. I may have encountered many authentic Christians who are
Mm.
in beautiful ways. I just didn't notice it. But the image that I formed, and I think the culture really, really didn't help. I'm quite certain our culture has been spending a lot of time, just like our culture has been kind of painting the father as buffoon. Homer
Mm.
Simpson and married with children across the entire field obligate. It's also been painting Christians as hypocrites, more or less, or repressed or artificial or something like that. Which is not to say that's not present. You can't do something that nobody experiences. You can't actually make that be an image. But now that I've actually entered into a authentic, deep, committed Christian community, and initially not as a Christian, I mean, the reality of it is very, very different than the image that I had, and that I think is quite dominant in the culture. And my heart like went out to you when you said you couldn't find a church where you could church.
Yeah. Yeah. So okay, so this is great. Okay. This brings up something that I think is really, really important and worth talking about. And it's where I ended the little reflection piece that I wrote about your conversation with Daniel. And it has to do with my ability to participate in church right now, because I have people ask me, not infrequently, right? Like, well, where do you go to church? Right? Because like I like to talk about God. I'll talk about, all I want to do is talk about God and Jesus. Like that, and that's why I say like I find myself more a Christian, because Jesus specifically for me is like, that's like, let's go there. If we can go anywhere, let's go there. Um, but my answer to that question has become like I'm trying really hard to figure out like, how do I answer that question truthfully? Because I don't know, like I don't understand it. And I think what it really comes down to is that in my upbringing, I I was there was a deep sense of trauma in relation to Christianity and church. Now, that trauma, it's interesting because like even as I hear you talk about these different people around me who had a similar sort of experience of church that I did, they will talk about particular people as seeming to be disingenuous and inauthentic and abusing the system and things like that. But that wasn't really my experience so much.
Hmm.
My experience, my parents, everyone that I think I got to know in those churches, I think there was a real sense of authenticity. I think the greatest gift my parents gave me was that like they were committed wholeheartedly to doing the best thing they could manage,
Mm-hmm.
however it made sense. And that ended up being pretty traumatic because of some particular, you know, just circumstances of their life and who they ended up around and those sorts of things. But those other people they ended up around in the church too that brought some of these traumatic strains, they were pretty authentic too. I think like I don't see them as being malicious people,
Hmm.
but there were these strange strains of it that incurred on my relation to reality and my relation to God specifically, as mediated by the church in that upbringing, that were really harmful, really difficult, really, like caused all the sorts of problems that then get projected into this cultural model. And I notice like my problem now is that when I go to a church, I have a hard time. Like I have to, when I go to church, all that shows back up for me
Hmm.
in a way that it doesn't have to when I don't go to church, right? And so when I go and visit churches now, I've sort of become aware of the fact that it's going to be an exercise for me. It's like it's a spiritual exercise for me to go to church to deal with my own trauma. Now, there's a way that I can make that a way bigger deal than it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a real danger, right? Um, and my wife and I are, my wife has her part of that too, and like so we're trying to work through that and actually find some church where we can plug into. And that's so that this is just a particular snapshot of where I'm at on this journey. But I think really what I'm trying to point to here is like, I wonder how many of us that are in this sort of like post-Christian space and trying to work our way around the edges of all these issues like faith and excavate all these things that became sort of hollowed out um and slandered, as you said at the beginning, virtues, Christian virtues that got sort of like slandered and hollowed out. Um, I was just working through a process doing this with some friends on the notion of purity, especially from a Christian perspective, which is that's a big one, right? That causes all kinds of cultural right. But as we're sort of excavating it, we're like, whoa, okay, this is really powerful and really beautiful. So it's like there's this process that I think we're all sort of trying to go through where it's like, okay, how do we remain faithful to the position that we've just find ourselves in, right? I just showed up in this life with this particular set of, you know, traumas that were given to me in relation to God. And now I'm like, no, I really want that thing. I really want that relationship with God. I really want that relationship with Christ. But I also need to be true to who I truly am. I'm not going to leave any parts of those behind. And so like coming back into that.
Well, there's no but there, right? Because I am the truth. You can't have a proper relationship with Christ if you are not fully in truth. Like there's no alternative. So you actually have this other half over here, like that deepening of truth, is a part of the coming back up here. And maybe that's been part of the journey that we collectively have been on for maybe a few generations, is kind of like a carving out of a new capacity to delve more deeply into truth so that we can actually develop more capacity to come more fully into relationship with Christ. I've had that sense, right? I have a sense of that this has not all been like a giant digression. The Lord uses things to move everything towards the good. And whether or not we call it, doing our normal thing and worshiping a golden calf 20 seconds after crossing the Red Sea, which we probably have been, nonetheless, all of that is being put to some proper good use. And so, so for example, one of the experiences that I had the first time I went to church was, so I'm going to describe it. So I'm listening to the sermon. So just you may recall this from my conversation with Danny. So I walk in, and the first experience I have is an aesthetic experience of the community, of the people, and not the building. The building is very modest. In fact, like even like orange carpet, like super lo-fi. Nice. People are healthy, like hale, wholesome, vibrant. There's a vividness. It's like full color. It's like, wow. There's aliveness in this room. This aliveness is powerful. An aesthetic experience. Like, okay, that's good. Now what? So now sitting in the sermon, as I'm listening, I'm listening in many ways, almost aesthetically. I don't understand in my mind at that time. I have very little ability to, like, when you were talking about the stumbling block, I'm like, yeah, okay, I see that. I know where that is in Paul. Like I can find those points. I'm not remembering a little bit of that. Back then, not at all. Right? So I'm just listening. But I'm kind of like vibing, to use a contemporary term. I'm sort of and what I'm noticing is, even though in many cases some of the things that he's saying is either like confusing or feels off from a cultural perspective, the deepest part of me that I trust the most to discern truth is just saying yes. Okay, this is interesting. Like good vibes. And I don't mean that even the least bit superficial. That's like the most profound thing from my point of view. And then maybe 2 or 3 times, at least 2 times, he says something, and I had this sense of like withdrawal or like contraction, like, ooh. It's like, okay, so what is that? And so I was able to reflect on it. And what I noticed as I reflected on it was that the deepest part of me was saying yes. And then some other part of me that was more superficial was saying no. So it was a deeper truth. A deeper truth was actually being drilled through. And some part of me that had been a different flavor of trauma, like which separates us from truth, that which separates from communion, had to deal with that. Right now, of course, at that point, I had a choice. I could either allow the trauma to win and step away from the deeper truth, or I could step into the deeper truth. And in this case, I think for whatever reason, I was able to be held in a place where I was like, wow, that was actually, and therefore very powerful, because what that meant was that I effectively grew through 2 areas, at least 2, maybe 3 areas of, let's say, sin or separation, right? Turning away from, or having been turned away from, and an orientation turned away from. In that sermon, it's like, wow, that's really powerful from a therapeutic perspective, like a healing experience at an existential level. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that that to me rings a similar note to how you connected faith earlier to this sort of like organic organic growth aspect, right? And I want to combine that with two other things that are central to Christianity is suffering and mercy.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because because that's the thing, right? There's this suffering that is attendant on the leaning in, that sort of leaning into that trauma. Like, okay, there's something where I want to jump back, and it's like, fair enough. There's something that I want to jump back. Instead of jumping back, how about I instead just sit with it? How about instead I lean in? Um, and maybe how about instead of treating treating the desire to jump back as a problem, how about I show mercy to that?
Mm-hmm.
How about I engage with a sort of merciful
Mm-hmm.
attention with the part of myself that wants to remain in separation? And the part, not only the trauma itself, but the part that is trying to jump away. Like, how do I do that in such a way that I can start to become a whole self, right?
Man,
This
that
sort
is
of
so good.
wholesomeness.
Uh-huh. I wanted like that part of how do I show mercy to that part of myself that wants to jump back? Like really just like allowing that to almost like settle in.
Mm.
It's beautiful. Yeah, so you had two words. I suffering is so deep that I lost the second one, but I found myself in a conversation, it's almost like perfect. I was at this place called Vitalia, which is like a
Mm.
pop-up community focused on immortality, more or less, longevity.
Mm. Mm.
And so
Mm.
one of the things they don't like is suffering.
Yeah.
Conversation with two folks who I quite like, both of them. And one of them I've known for a while. And we ended up talking about suffering. I said, well, again, this is like you said, like faith and many other terms has been slandered. So it's been twisted and turned upside down. The basic notion of suffering is just to undergo. If I pick up a rock and move it from one place to another, I am suffering the carrying, the journeying, the heaviness of the rock. And then what we can talk about is that, okay, so I'm experiencing experience, I'm undergoing experience. And in the process of undergoing experience, I am having like, let's just say pain. Let's move from suffering all the way to pain. So some part of the suffering is nutritional by its very nature. There's nothing about it. Nobody's going to be like, well, that part of undergrowing I don't want. No, we want the nutritional part. Well, how about the pain part? Let's
Yeah.
zoom in. So now I'm having parts of me are being broken or torn. And then I'm like, well, no pain, no gain. Like there's something about the experience of development that seems to imply parts of us have to be broken or shifted or torn so that we can grow. Oh, well, okay. Well, now let's call that meaningful pain. This is pain associated with a larger context of growth. It's part of a process and a necessary part of the process, which now fits in. Well, okay. Well, if you're suffering and you're experiencing pain, but it's meaningful pain, then once again you're like, okay, I get it. That's actually no problem. So like, what about meaningless pain? Like, well, okay, we don't like meaningless pain. Now there's an open question: is there such a thing as meaningless pain? How much of that is actually our own rejection of the capacity to be in relationship with God, for example? And there, I don't know. And oddly enough, what popped into my head there was the crucifixion and the two thieves. Right, thief number one, meaningless pain. He is now just being crucified. He is suffering, and he is suffering in a way that is not going to lead to salvation at all. Mm-hmm. Thief number two, objectively in the same location, right? A thief, suffering, crucifixion. But he's able to get to a place where he turns it into meaningful pain. His suffering is now, not only is he saved, he's like the first one saved. So it's actually a beautiful symbolic or representation of that's where we're faced with, right? We're faced with that dynamic. And in many cases, that's the pivot point upon which our choice, our will, our ability to move from here to here is the decisive movement. If we move here, we can find ourselves, back to the cave metaphor, we can find that rope, we can find that light, we can begin groping up the suffering of our climb in the darkness, because it's now oriented in a direction of meaningfulness. It's reconnected fully into that organic whole. And we're no longer living in an apartness, a separateness, a turning away, moving at least towards a reintegration, right? A communion, right? That's the right term. I've been really taken by the notion of liturgy as I've been hearing it from the Orthodox side, as in this word of raveling, like taking a rope and raveling it together. That
Mm. Mm.
liturgy is the work we do together to bring us into communion, which is to say, from a
Mm.
multiplicity into a unity. So liturgy is the work we do together to move from being a multiplicity through communion into a unity. And to the degree to which we're then on a through line where that communion is communion with Christ, which then is the way to the Father, we are now bringing into bigger and bigger and bigger levels of communion up and up and up the stack to the highest point. Yeah, so I very much been liking that.
Yeah. Oh, man. Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Mm. Sorry, that
Yeah,
just
well,
letting
you don't
that
mind
land a
kind
little
of
bit.
say the other two pieces that I've kind of been playing
Please.
with?
Yeah, please.
As I've been chewing on that a lot, I've been noticing two other sort of terms. One is anti-liturgy, and the other
Mm.
is false liturgy.
Mm.
So
Mm-hmm.
we experience liturgy all the time. The Super Bowl was the most recent example. And this is, in fact, a multiplicity, doing work together to come into communion, into a new oneness, a being. That's false liturgy. And the reason why it's false liturgy is that it's not on that through line. It's not oriented in this hierarchy where it's nested under a path that will actually get you all the way to the top. So it becomes idolatrous, which is super is. Like if you just pay any attention to, like, wow, and you're idolizing the Kansas City Chiefs, like really? That's actually, or Taylor Swift, whichever version of that universe you happen to be part of. It's like if you can sort of sit back and go, so that you're going to end up worshiping the Kansas City Chiefs. Like that's the God that you've chosen to pay homage to. That's the divinity, the sacredness that you're going to be in communion with is the Kansas City Chiefs. Okay.
Yep. It's a through line that has a very definite end. Like it's a very finite through line that you're jumping on here.
Very finite and very, very, very sort of profane in the sense of superficial. There's
Yeah.
tiny, tiny amount of good that comes from it. And then therefore, all false liturgy ultimately grounds in an anti-liturgy. Because when you
Mm.
hit that finite end, you now have the demoralization, the disillusionment that will then bring you into an unraveling with the actual liturgical work. And you sort of like, this is the experience of the secular world so much, maybe in sometimes my own experience of, hey, we've done this communion, we've kind of done a form of liturgy, we found something, and maybe we found something pretty high,
Yeah.
but it's not infinite, right? It's not the actual infinite. It's not connected step by step with a path, a way that can get us all the way. And so what ends up happening is that it doesn't work. It fails in some deeply, deeply profound way, which then leads to a trauma with liturgy itself. And that would be
Mm.
a anti-liturgical consequence. Maybe it's not always anti-liturgical. Maybe false liturgy you can move further and further towards true liturgy from there. And of course, anti-liturgy is also super common in our environment, things that unravel us. And trauma is anti-liturgical. Trauma is something where it causes us to avoid, and that avoiding, that turning away from is almost like its essence.
Mm. Yeah, this is really good. This is really good. I mean, I think it's interesting because uh, I don't know how familiar you are with the terms the diabolical and the Luciferian. Sim
I've watched some of your videos.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Yeah, yeah, but like that idea seems to me similarly analogous. It's like
Yeah.
liturgy is pulling you into the symbol, pulling you into proper symbolic participation.
Yes.
False liturgy is participation with the diabolical,
Yeah.
and then which grounds out in this sort of Luciferian. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Very, very nice. Yeah. Very nice.
yeah. I think, and this is where like I think your points about there's something so profound, I think, about this the sense of just real live, not necessarily sophisticated, although I'm sure there's many people in that church that you're a part of that are very sophisticated, but the sense of just like the resonance of, hey, these are people doing the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like like it's not some, in your story, how you talk about going to this AI conference in San Francisco and your wife going to this church and this sort of like massive opposite experience of those two things. And the recognition of like, okay, pushing this ladder doesn't seem to be making things better.
Yeah.
Doing this really basic thing seems to be good. It's like This is the this is the thing with Christianity, man. This is the thing with Jesus, and this whole thing is like you can take it as far up as you want to go if you're on the right ladder, right? Like jump on with Saint Maximus the Confessor, and you go some wild places, right? Or Pseudo Dionysius or Nicholas of Cusa, or whoever you want. Like jump on with those guys, and you can go way up, way out. And you know what? But the thing is, like, you can come all the way back down, and the entire route has and especially if you actually like existentially trying to participate with it. Like there's a through line of connectedness that comes all the way down to where that idea that the most philosophical act you'll ever do is changing your baby's diaper actually makes sense and it lands.
Yeah, yeah. So man, yeah, I mean, I've been making like a little twist here.
Yeah.
What was coming up for me is like it's fun. Like, but what I'm noticing is that I don't feel like we're right now living kind of like bridging. We're actually sitting in the center in some really interesting overlapped way. There's an old homily that comes from complexity studies, like complexity science, that talks about the difference between an engineering designed complicated system and a grown complex system.
Mm.
And the difference is something like a complex system has, and I don't mean this like literally in a geometric level, subtle connections at multiple levels of scale, multiple distances, multiple modes. And think about like just the way like bones form, right? There's a process of actually being in the body where the bones are slightly broken and new bridges are taken. It's extremely complex. We should say it's vastly rich and is utterly non-replicable using the engineering design complicated methodology. Okay. So complex system science can take that to the level of something like, say, an ecology. We can do it at the level of an ecosystem. We can certainly do it at the level of like a body, a biological body, but even at the level of an ecosystem. What we're saying here with Christianity is Christianity just takes that all the way to the limits of all reality. It says, hey, the same thing, man. You know, this we can go all the way up and all the way down, but if you're doing it in the context of Christ, you're held in the full complexity of the actual reality, which shouldn't be at all surprising, right? The same complexity that you see at multiple levels of scale coming up from the molecular into the cellular into the organism and the ecology. Like you're noticing that you're transitioning levels of scale, and they seem to maintain this continuity of complexity, and the way that these integrated wholes have relationality that is intrinsically transcends our desire to slice them into atomic units. We'll just expand that to the whole of all. And that's the thing. And there's some methodology that we can enter into relationship with, which we can call, now we'll shift slightly to the logos, which is exactly that, right? So it's through line of that complexity. And if you can play in that space, wow, I'm having a like transcendent experience at this moment. So long ago, I remember saying in my at one of the game B meetings, like a long time ago, it's like, oh, so we have to figure out how to actually operate by means of complexity in complexity,
Yeah.
not by complicated as in relationship with complexity. Like that was like the epistemological chef. Turns out Christianity is that work.
Yeah. Oh man. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. 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 Exactly. And okay, now let me take this. Just say yes to all of that. Big yes. And then I want to turn it, like you said, I want to pull in a little bit of a bridging thing because I want to call back to this sort of like cultural idol of Christianity and this sort of like traumatic experience with that. It's like, okay, so a lot of people, okay, so pull in the ecosystem. I had this thought the other day of like, I was trying to explain to my daughter, my daughter's maybe she's certainly too young to understand this explanation. She's 15 months old, but we have little conversations, and so I just try things out, right? And she was noticing the wood, and she was noticing how the wood on our table was different from the metal piece on our table, and she was sort of like puzzled about that. And so I was trying to explain it to her. And in the process of doing that, I was saying, well, that's a tree over there, and we cut it down and we cut it into pieces, and now it's a wood, right? Complex system into a complicated system. And it hit me. It's like, you know, people talk about, prehistoric man, or we even call them cavemen, right? We lived in caves or in trees, basically, right? It's like, oh, we still live in caves and trees. We just break them into pieces and re-put them into different pieces before we live in them. But
Mhm.
it's just a cave and a tree put together.
Mhm.
And it's like, okay, well, that's pretty much what we do with large ecosystems, right? We exist in a complex environment, has a complex things, and we make complicated things out of them. And it's like, well, a lot of people have done that with Christianity over a long time. And to
Yes.
the degree
Yeah.
to the degree that they've done that, most times people get hurt. And this excavation that you were pointing towards earlier, this this recognition of this sort of like, oh, okay, there's a whole part of our body that's been sort of corrupted by this multiplicity of complicated systems that have harmed people. If we're gonna be a body, right? Like I think of, gosh, I don't want to get too much into sort of those things. Um, like if we're gonna do a sort of like true Catholic church, I'll use that, right? Like a true, like, for everyone, everybody's a part of this body. Like we need to do some serious excavation,
Mhm. We do. Yeah.
right?
We
And
do.
that's that sort of like, okay, then now we
Oh,
have a way to explain how that actually works, and a way to call towards like, okay, but the problem isn't that they got this point wrong. The problem isn't that they messed up this piece of theology or this thing. Like maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But the point is that they made a complicated structure and tried to live in it. And what you actually need to do is come into right relation with the ever increasing complexity and grow an organic thing.
whew. Well, I mean, easier said than done, but properly said. Properly said. I mean that. So let's rewind a bit because I want to kind of hit that now. The point is not any disputation over different complicated structures. As soon as we're in that mode, we've already failed. We're already lost. And by the way, we're going to come to fisticuffs because there's no solution to be found in that space that doesn't ground out in violence. And we've already agreed that that isn't even the nature of what we're doing. Like we violated the prime directive if we've rated up there. So notice that's a two-step process. If you're able to conquer, once you've entered in that, you've actually violated your prime directive. You are in sin. You're in league with the devil as soon as you stepped in that spot. Right. So all of you, every Christian, I'm telling you right now, if you're in that world, you're in league with the devil. Repent and sin no more. Okay, well, what does this thing over here look like? So again, easier said than done, but I've been very, very taken with this Russian, I think maybe French, English, American theologian, Schneemann, I think is how you say his name.
Mm,
Book I've been reading, reading slowly for the life of the world. Like
mm,
it's dense, it's intense. But one of the points he keeps making is he actually makes a triadic distinction.
mm,
He talks about the secular, the
mhm,
religious, and the Christian.
mm,
And he very
mm,
specifically says
mm.
over and over again, the Christian is anti-religious. So now we have to kind of rewind from the beginning of our conversation. We talked about the secular and the religious, and Schmemann is saying, no, no, no. The religious is still, let's say in some sense, fundamentally, both of those are living at the level of the complicated. And what we were talking about as the religious is this other thing over here. And that's fine. Like we can make
Yeah.
those. Um, and that I can't help but just be so let me say, I think that's right. Like the deep part of me is like, yep, this is right. And there's the thing that I had as a hit, Michael Levin, you probably
Mm,
did. So this notion of what is it that allows the developing stem cells in a zygote slash two embryo find their proper location in the chemical milieu? And it's not written in the DNA. The DNA has a blueprint that says you need to be in this XYZ position. That ain't how it works. But there's something else going on. Well, the name we can give that something else going on would be, let's say the spirit, right? The spirit of the developing embryo that creates a field effect that allows each of these things to find their proper location, which, by the way, is not an undifferentiated organism. Right? We have organs, we have tissues, right? They are different. They are different because they need to be different for the larger body to actually be a functional whole body, right? And so we talk about a truly Catholic church. Maybe a truly Catholic church is not homogenous. Maybe it actually has distinctions, and those distinctions are distinctions because there are organs that play different roles, for example. But the methodology you're speaking to is this methodology of being in the spirit. right? This methodology of being one of these stem cells, being guided not by our own preferences, our own ideologies, our own doctrines, our own complicated systems, however beautiful and how functional they may be, because they're functional, but fundamentally guided by the Spirit, and then living in that way and learning how to live this thing into its beingness. Ooh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And like you said, right? Very well said, first of all. Very well said. But as you said, you know, it's so hard to do. And not hard to do in the sense of like, you got to try really hard. Hard to do in the sense of like,
Hmm.
it takes all of you, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's this I think it's from Lewis. I think there's this quote from Lewis. Maybe it's from Mere Christianity, where he says, um, a lot of people think they can come to Jesus, or a lot of people come to Jesus because they want him to help them fix something that's broken, right? Like I need to really stop drinking so much or something. But that's not the deal. Like the deal that Jesus makes with you is I'll help you fix your drinking, but I'm gonna fix every other thing too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like I'm not going to stop. It's gonna be wholesale. I'm not going to stop until you're perfect. And that's the sensibility of it. And that's where it gets back to the way we were talking about religious initially, which I think is a real distinction from what you were saying. I'm sorry, I forgot the schmear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Schmidt,
Um, yeah.
I think.
Um, and that is that it's this deeply existential, it's this shifting of existential modes. Like it takes a real like to actually transition to a way of being in the world where you recognize that, hey, I'm the stem cell listening for the call of where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
Like, that's a really different place than at least what I've, like what our culture teaches us, what we're brought into in our default mode. It's very different.
Yeah, and I think this is where so many things go wrong. Is a yeah, and a tiny, tiny holdback. So
Yeah.
you're in your example, there was a large holdback. Hey, I'm going to be me, but could you get rid of the alcoholism? But the things go really wrong when you're like, no, I'm all the way in. And maybe I don't even acknowledge this tiny holdback. It might be the teeniest bit, but that's the piece. Like that's the you're still fundamentally grounded over here. And you've kind of put all this stuff over there, but as it turns out, it's all a simulation. And that's where it gets really, really ugly and gets to be a mess. Now, of course, the beautiful thing is Christ is not confused by what you're about, right?
Yeah.
He'll continue to work on that one piece. Is going to have all kinds of trials and tribulations until that one piece finally goes in mercy, right? The mercy comes to that piece, and then mercy goes, okay, are you ready? Yeah. Here's good news. The good news is my yoke is light. Here's good news. You are in fact immersed fully, completely in a faithful love. This is all, you can just surrender into this because this is the place that you've yearned for, but you don't have to be the one who creates it, but you never could have anyway. But you
Yeah.
can be part of this body that is it's happening.
Yeah. And maybe that's the hard part is like we don't know how to not move ourselves. We're so used to we're so used to, you know, trying to move ourselves into something, right? But this is at the existential level that gets at it. Even using that word doesn't feel right. That like the depth of it is such that it's not actually, well, you said it earlier, right? It's a resignation.
Yeah.
You're resigning yourself into something about your own life, about the nature of reality, about, yeah, you're just, yeah, like, yeah, because even when, I don't know, I guess here, okay, what I'm trying to do is sort of feel into how you're talking, right? And how you're talking about that little piece, right? And I was looking at that for myself as you were talking about it. I'm like, where's that little piece? Because I seem to find that I always have some little piece,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that's what just keeps happening for me over and over. It's like, okay, I think I've really bought in. Like I think I've really surrendered into whatever the good has for me, whatever God has for me, whatever however we want to language that. And then I find that there's this little piece left over. And so I'm trying to get at that and like what would it mean to not have any peace? And that's what I'm sort of reaching for as I'm talking about this.
Yeah, well, what I've noticed in my life so far, and I've been reading, I think Dallas Willard is the guy who I think has done, for me at least, the best work here. Is there's almost like two flavors. One flavor is inertial. So these are, let's just say, bad habits. Lots of those, right? Lots and lots of those. For me, anger is a really nice, strong piece that's still going in the wrong direction, but its second derivative is in the right direction, right? So it's still heading away from God, but it's slowing down. So, so that's a big piece. And for all of us, we're cut through with variations of bad habits. They're all over the place, and then many of them are mutually reinforcing in bad context. And you use like in some sense ordinary secular language to describe a lot of that. The process whereby we actually properly heal those traumas and properly begin to move them in the right direction is not a secular context. But then you have the second, which is the will. Where is the will still pointing the wrong direction? So it's not just inertial, it actually has a motive power. It actually has an acceleration vector going the wrong way. That's the part where you have the most trouble. And that's the one that I'm really pointing at, is one little tiny piece of the will that says, look, I will, it's funny, Christ says, my yoke is light. It's like, great, why don't you carry all this heavy stuff for me, but I'm still going to be in charge. Like, no, that's the area. That's the problem. No. He will carry all kinds of heavy stuff for you, but all of your will has to now be orienting in his direction. You really do have to follow him and learn how to do that. Like, just learn how to add your will in that direction. Here's the beautiful thing. It's like you've been swimming upstream this whole time, dude. There's a current. Just go with the current. And guess what? The river's going to the sea, and the sea is where you've been wanting to go the whole time. So you weren't going to get there swimming the wrong direction, and it was really hard. Like, it's like this a very silly thing. But as you say, our experience as individuals, and part of this, by the way, is actually part of our journey as in a first order communion, as being part of a tribe, right? And the second order movement of becoming individuals. We had to become individuals. And so we've been going through this process of being individuals. And of course, our experience as being individuals is that our will is at the center of our individuality. And if you're invited to surrender that, you may experience that as moving a retrograde back to the older version, but that's not the point. The point is actually a transcendence up into this new kind of thing. It is a new world that we are invited into. The kingdom of heaven is a new kind of thing. It's a new kind of world. It's not a retrograde back to a previous version. So this higher communion, not a local communion with your local gods and your local tribe, but actually communion with God. And that's a very different kind of invitation. And so when the will has that feeling of, wait, no, I don't want to give that up because my experience has been one of that actually takes me off of the journey that I'm supposed to be on. Honor that. Like, this is going back to that mercy on that part of yourself. Like, yes, okay, I get it. You have done good work, my friend. You've really done incredible work bringing us here. And now you've been given an invitation to move into a completely higher tone. The place you've been trying to get us to, the mountaintop that you've been endeavoring, the cave you've been trying to climb out of, a rope is now ready. A rope is here. You no longer have to be trying to do this on your own. You can now hold on to that rope and now put your will on the rope. And the rope will guide you in the direction that is up, right? It becomes very simple in some very important fundamental sense, which doesn't mean there's not a lot of climbing to be done. Doesn't mean there's not a lot of work to be done. But now there's an integrating basis, or there's an orienting directionality that can help everything now move properly.
Yeah. That might be a good place to wrap up. That's yeah.
I really enjoyed this conversation, man.
Likewise, I've really been looking forward to it, and I just, I mean, like I said the first time we met, like I've so much appreciated you and your work throughout, but I feel like, I mean, I think there's a new level of communion that I think we can engage with in relation to some of these things. That's really cool. So thank you.
If you ever find yourself coming out to the East Coast, you can come by our church and give it a test.
That sounds wonderful. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, my friend.
Hi, brother.